which I was so pleased with that. I just thought it sounded ace. But it's all the little tasteful things that really bring it to that next level.
Ocean quietly gliding, colliding, we fly away at you.
Hey guys, it's Kobi McCoull. Welcome back to another episode of Tuesday Tunes. Now in this episode, I'm going to do something slightly different to the usual because I'm going to break it down into two parts. I've made an R&B/trap or hip hop beat that I'd like to share with you, but to cover some of the depth that there is within the beat, I'd like to break it down into the production side and the mixing side. So this is the first video of which I'm going to go over the production, but in the second video I'm going to go over the mixing. Now it's not actually that easy to separate these two parts because there's a very significant crossover, much like a Venn diagram, where the production and the mixing are separate but they actually influence each other so significantly. So I will be sure to mention the parts where I am producing with mixing in mind, but there are still significant enough differences that I can make a part 1 and a part 2. So I'll play you a short clip of the beat just to give you an idea of the overall sound, and then we'll jump into the production side of the beat.
Flood of violet, the lilac, delighted, I'm floating up to you. Ocean quietly gliding, colliding, we fly away at you. La lilac, fly away at you. La lilac, flood of violet, la lilac, delighted, I'm floating up to you. Ocean quietly gliding, colliding.
Okay, so let's get into the production side of this beat. The first place I want to start with are these synthy keys and pads that I used. I wanted these to be pretty thick and luscious, but also quite slow and smooth, because a lot of R&B stuff often is very smooth and silky. I wanted this melody to be very simple and not too overpowering and draw too much of people's attention, but I still wanted it to be really sonically pleasing. So it's actually a little soft piano, but it's got some bit crush on it, and the bit crush automates up and down every now and again to draw attention back to the sound before it then calms down again. And that's a perfect example straight off the bat of the crossover, that Venn diagram of production and mixing, because although it helps the production, it makes it more interesting, it also actually helps the mix, because you can have this little lead there doing its thing, and then every now and again you increase the bit crush. It just reminds people that it's there. Whereas if you just have it doing the same thing the whole time, it's almost like your ear forgets about it, because our brains are kind of like that. They're drawn to certain things that are somewhat new. So that's roughly what it sounds like, but when the bit crush comes up, it sounds more like this. It's just slightly more distorted than it would have been. I have the MIDI here for the keys and the pad, but I've exported them just to help the computer cope. So if I go into the MIDI, you'll see that it's actually just the same melody repeating itself 4 times, apart from in the middle I thought I'll just add one other subtle thing to make it slightly different, and it's the same kind of effect as the bit crush. Adding that subtle difference in just draws your ear and your attention back to it briefly, but it's not crazy. There's not loads of stuff going on. The melody itself also ties into the drums and the pocket of the drums, which I'll talk about later. So it does the same thing. And then here, it just goes up to a slightly different note. Now the only other thing that I did to make it even more interesting and draw more attention to it was in the more energetic parts of the beat, I just threw it up an octave. So I also then added some reverb to it to give spaciousness and delay, and that's something I did throughout the whole beat because that's the kind of energy and the sonic environment that I wanted the beat to take place in. I then also automated all of those, but I'm going to go into more detail about automation in general in the mixing side, although automation can be used for both production and mixing. So the next thing along with those keys was this really thick, luscious pad. Both of these sounds came from Omnisphere. I took them from existing sounds and just tweaked them so that they sounded the way that I would like. So this pad is very simple. It just plays the main chords of the song and I just leave it ringing out, but I have a gross beat automating to slide down at the end of each phrase, but I then also automate the gross beat to turn on and off. I don't want every phrase to slide off because it can get kind of annoying. So for example, here it slides. But then the next bit you can see, even though the gross beat's there, I've automated it off. So it's just holding itself steady because I didn't want the pad to draw too much attention to itself all the time. Another way that I made the pad bring itself out more was automating a cutoff filter within Omnisphere to come up so that it was a bit brighter and thicker and more intense. And again, that's a production technique, but it also helps significantly with the mix. Here, for example, so the sound is quite small here, and then here it's much bigger. And then it comes right up here to emphasize this slide. All of the processing that I did to those sounds to make them gel even more with the vibe of the beat, I will talk about in the mixing part of this video. Then the only other notable thing I did within the instruments was adding some reverse sounds. And those are just this keys sound printed out and reversed. The next bit I want to cover are the drums. So I just wanted to go with a basic kick and snare pattern and not make it too complicated, because in R&B that's very often the case. It's just a simple kick and a snare. And the tempo is at 94 BPM, and around that tempo is very common for R&B or smoother, chill hip-hop songs. The snare is just the offbeat all the way through the bar. But I also added a different variation to the snare here. Like I say, variation is the constant spice that you want, but you don't want to overdo it and add far too much because then it can just become overpowering. Now, you can hear there's a significant amount of effects playing on the snare, and I'll explain those in just a second, but I'm going to turn them off just to give you an idea of what the snare and kick sound like with no effects. So I've just got the normal note that's happening all the way through, but the variation is that I've pitched it down and then also changed the volume so that it slides up like this, and also changed the panning. I like to call this DNA panning because it looks like the DNA helix. So they're quieter, and by being panned, those snares are thinner. If you just had them all the same volume and just playing over and over again, like if I do that quickly, it's just far too much. Let's see what this sounds like. It just sounds horrendous. The reason that it does work is because there are subtle differences between them all. Now, when you're adding anything tasteful over the top of something, it's got to be controlled like that in order for it to feel real, to feel authentic. Computer software can do everything so perfectly, and you actually want to add in more human elements and dynamics. I mentioned them in the last lo-fi video that I had for you guys, where essentially I sent the snare information to a separate channel and then just added loads of effects onto the snare. So you've got a reverb, another version of reverb, a delay, an ozone imager just to add even more width, and then a pan for it to go from side to side, and then a chorus just to add even more depth to the whole thing. Now, I didn't put all of this onto the snare channel itself because that would just make it a wash and a complete mess and I wouldn't be able to control it. So sending it to the separate channel, I can then automate the volume of the snare effect so that it can be big and large and luscious, which fits the vibe of the rest of the song when I want it to be, but then I can also turn it off when I don't want it to be there. So it's quiet there, but then becomes much bigger here. And it just adds body and character to the snare that wouldn't be there if it was just on its own. Now when you are listening to it soloed like that, it can sound quite extreme, but it's not as significant, is nowhere near as significant when everything else is blended together. Another example of a crossover between production and mixing. It actually fills the mix out nicely. It gives this body that wouldn't be there if it was just on its own. So the hats would be the next thing, and I have two different types of hat. So this first hat is providing a slower, more simple rhythm. It's all been generated based around what the kick and the snare are doing. And much like in the snare in that second version there's just subtle variation within the MIDI of the hat. Different volumes, slightly different panning, and different notes as well. It just adds dynamic and shape to the snare rather than just being the same the whole time. And much the same with these hats, except they're thinner, lighter, and they play slightly more often. People often talk about the pocket, the drum pocket. That's what you're trying to create. It's this vibe, the energy that comes behind it. Understanding that just comes with practice, and also listening to other songs and going, where do they cluster the drums together? They are separate, but they all move together. And you can tell when something's in the pocket when everything is moving together and subsequently making you move along with it. Whereas if something's just in the wrong place and it's sticking out and it doesn't fit with everything, then you know that it's not in the pocket. But again, lots of that comes down to taste. Then I added some really little soft foley here. And so you can see what I mean about the pocket. Like I love what that does to it. So I've got the little foley hats that make, it's like a tiny open hat. But then I've reversed that open hat into the snare so that everything goes and it hits even harder. So when you have a little open hat like that, even though it's soft and subtle, it gives this falling feeling. So that's like, and everything pushes down. And then when it reverses back up and the snare comes in, it gives this rising feeling. And then you have this pause where everything is up higher. This is what I mean about the pocket. There's this higher part of the energy and it's waiting for the next kick or the next drum sound to come in to break that. And you're just doing that to someone over and over again. It's like waves in an ocean. It's just rising and falling. And that's what creates the head bob. Then, just to add even more to that, in the bigger parts of the songs, I have these bigger open hats. And the whole thing really moves. Now, the only other element that I would talk about with the production of these drums is that actually the drum samples themselves that I started with just weren't working quite as well as I'd hoped they would. I wasn't sure why until I then tested it out with a different loop that I'd come across, and I realized that I wanted everything to be dirtier. I wanted the drum sounds to have more grit and be less clean. I think in the future I'll probably go into more depth about how to select better drum sounds, because that drastically changed how much I was enjoying the sound of this beat. But everything's kind of pitched down, like even the hats have been pitched down, the snare comes from down, so it's not by much, but just subtly. That's often why you see producers pitching their hats down. The next thing that I added in, which was actually one of the most simple parts, was just an 808. And I just wanted this to be thick and full, but I also wanted it to slide. I didn't want to completely overdo it and have them kicking about all over the place, because again, I just wanted it to fit with the smoothness of the whole thing. But there isn't too much to go into about those 808s, at least not this time. Then the next section, the final instrument part of the song, were the guitars. And all I did was take the electric guitar, put it into the DI, and just played a bunch of little things that just sounded cool on their own. But I knew that I was going to add lots of effects to them, so I didn't even worry about making the quality of the recording or even the playing really high, because I knew I was going to wash them out with lots of reverb beforehand anyway. So I'm going to turn all of the processing off and just play you the little loop that I started with on its own. Now when you record something into the DI, it can often be blippy and not actually sound that nice, whereas recording it into a mic can be much more thick and full. So I knew that I was going to need to add loads of effects to that sound. And as you can see here, that's exactly what happened. First thing I did was I EQ'd it, then I added an imager just to add even more stereo space, and I also added a stereo shaper just to change the dynamic. I just added warp depth to it, which just changes the pitch. It just kind of makes it swell up and down. Like if I push it to its most extreme, now obviously that's burning the toast. It's gone far too far to the other side, but that subtly, it just adds even more character. I always talk about character. That's what people often really like about sounds, is that they've got depth and character to them. So adding all of these effects, that's all I'm trying to do with the guitar. Then to make it fit with everything else, I just sent it to some reverb and delay. So the reverb and delay add even more spaciousness to the whole thing, and they also wash it out so that the blippiness that you get from the DI from the guitar is reduced a little bit. When you record into a direct input, it can seem kind of tinny with the guitar. But I separated them out so that I had control over each of the individual ones, and I'll go into that in more detail in the mixing part because that's really significant. You don't want reverbs to overcrowd everything or the delays to be too crazy. Now, one of the things that I thought was really cool on the delay that I hadn't realized I could do before is changing the grain division and the grain shape. Now, if I turn these right down and just listen to the delay, it's really clean, and that's fine if that's what you want to go for. But if you turn it back up, it gives it this weird grit to it. It makes everything kind of shimmer and shudder, and what I found was really fascinating after having done that to the guitar, then when I listened to it with the drums, it almost made it sound like the kick was doing that to the guitar. Like the kick was hitting as hard as it was, that it was making the guitar shake. But because I separated it out so that it was just happening to the delay, it didn't completely crush the guitar. It still meant that the main signal of the guitar sounded clean, but the delay just sounded like it was being smashed by the kick, and it was really cool. And then obviously adding the 808 in the bass as well, it just makes the whole thing feel like it's shaking and vibrating. Which I was so pleased with that. I just thought it sounded ace. But it's all the little tasteful things that really bring it to that next level. So I just had that little loop there, which I have sent left and right just to give even more width. But then I also have slightly different melody. Which is just a kind of little blippy chord that I played. And then I also just have individual notes here, which I just separated them out. Here. The only thing else that I did was recorded those guitar sounds, sent to the reverb, and with the vocal I just wanted to go for something kind of similar to the guitar, but I wanted presence there.
Flood the violet, la lilac, delighted, I'm floating up to you. Ocean quietly gliding, colliding, we fly away at you.
So I've got some really big delays and some really luscious reverbs on the vocal as well. And the way that I sung the vocal too, I wanted it to be kind of soft and silky.
Flood the violet, la lilac, delighted, I'm floating up to you.
This is one of the biggest crossovers between the production and the mixing. So I wanted the vocals to be soft and breathy and spacious, but I still wanted there to be presence within the vocal. And if you just slap a reverb and delays on, then that's exactly what can happen. It can just get washed out. So much like I did with the guitar, I took the main vocal chain and had it on its own and processed that. But then I sent it to a whole reverb, a plate reverb, a full delay, and a half delay. So if I play the effects on their own, you'll see how everything sounds.
Blood of violet.
So by separating it out and having two different delays at the same time, one of the delays gives you a present delay that you can hear. You make the distinction. When I say la la, you hear
Lilac, fly away at you.
So they're actually much more discernible. You can hear those delays happening, whereas the other delay creates much more wash and you can't really work out what's going on, but it just adds this ethereal feel to the whole thing.
Lilac, fly away.
And then so when you mix that in with the reverb and the other delays, everything just sounds like this luscious, spacious vibe.
Lilac, fly away at you.
So that was that. I really hope that you enjoyed the beat and maybe you learned something new. If you have any questions or comments, please do leave them down below. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and subscribe, all of those wonderful things. I really appreciate it. Thanks for checking it out, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one, probably part 2 of this video. But until then, bye!
Glide.